Okay, and thanks very much for the invitation from Joe, and delighted to be here to try and talk through this. So what I want to do is kind of run through the National Spatial Strategy and provide a kind of a historical overview, and then move on to what might kind of replace it, which has been mooted earlier this year, which is the National Planning Framework. So this is the, and I apologise if you can't read this from the back, I'm going to read bits of it out. This is the text from the Taoiseach Bertie Ahern at the time in the foreword to the National Spatial Strategy, where he says it's a 20-year strategy designed to enable every place in a country to reach its potential, no matter what size or location. It seeks to organise and coordinate these roles in a complementary win-win way. In order to achieve more balanced regional development, a greater share of economic activity must take place outside the Greater Dublin region. And then he kind of says that we need to set out a framework for this, which is gateways and hubs, and so on. And then the National Spatial Strategy will enable all sectors of the economy to plan future investment in a better informed way. And then lastly, the government will ensure that its own policies are implemented in a manner that's consistent with the National Spatial Strategy. And what I want to do is the three bits that I've highlighted there are things that I'm going to kind of come back to. So this is the National Spatial Strategy. I'm sorry about the washed-out colours of the map, but actually that is the washed-out colours of the map that are in the brochure. So the National Spatial Strategy divided the country up into 5 zones. So it was consolidating the Greater Dublin area, strengthening the south, southeast, west and northwest to complement Dublin, revitalising the west and the southwest, reinforcing the central parts of Ireland and the southeast, and cooperating in an all-Ireland context, i.e. all things to all people in all places, something for everybody in the audience. And the 9 gateways were Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick, Waterford, Dundalk, Sligo, Letterkenny, Derry, Athlone, Tullamore, Mullingar as one kind of interlinked gateway. And the 9 hubs were, and each of those were meant to be 100,000 plus population. They were going to grow. If they weren't already at 100,000, then they were to grow beyond 100,000. And the 9 hubs were Cavan, Ennis, Kilkenny, Mallow, Monaghan, Tuam, Wexford, Ballina, Castlebar as a twinned, and Tralee, Killarney as a twinned hub. And all of these were to grow to between populations of 20,000 to 40,000 people, so to try and provide some level of critical mass. Now, what I think is instructive to do is, and to try and get a sense of the thinking behind and the pathway into the National Spatial Strategy, is to actually map out some of the policy and legislation that preceded it, so you can kind of get a handle on how it came into being, what its rollout was, and what its demise is. And I've basically divided this up into 3 time periods. So the first one is this kind of phase 1 and foundation. So planning is just over 50 years old in the country now. It came into being in 1963 with the Local Government Planning and Development Act, which came into force in 1964. And it introduced local development plans and planning permissions into the country, and it also created 87 planning authorities, which are mostly the local authorities and town and borough councils. But importantly, there was no higher level oversight over those plans. It was left at that planning authority, so there was no kind of oversight at a regional level or at a national level. People were kind of in charge of their own local destiny. In 1986, we used to have the start of the Urban Renewal Act, which was the introduction of tax incentive-led development for urban areas. In 1994, we have the 8 regional authorities being established through the Local Government Act of 1991, and they would evolve to have a regional planning function. So they became the basis on which the kind of agencies around the regional planning guidelines. 1997, we have Sustainable Development, a strategy for Ireland, which included policies on spatial planning, on urban development, on regeneration. Then into 1997, we have the announcement of the first National Development Plan. So that was the kind of the initiation of that, and then it went into the planning phase. In March 1998, we have the Finance Act, and that introduced a rural renewal scheme. So this now extends the tax incentives into rural areas and in particular into the Upper Shannon area, where instead of having tax incentives based around particular towns or settlements, it gave tax incentives to build anywhere within those local authorities, or within the boundary of the Upper Shannon Rural Renewal Scheme. 1999, we have the European Spatial Planning Perspective. So I should have said, by the way, the little acronyms at the end of the departments are basically in charge. So DOF is Department of Finance, DEC is Department of Environment, Heritage Local Government became Department of Environment, Community Local Government. So just because I think that's an important part of the story, is how this is swapping backwards and forwards between finance and environment around kind of economic spatial strategy. Okay. So this is a European policy, so this is an EU Commission policy about trying to coordinate spatial planning across the European Union. It's about territorial cohesion, so 3 pillars of European Union: social, economic, territorial cohesion. This is the policy underpinning territorial cohesion. Department of Environment participated in that development, and it became part of the thinking within the department. And it was also the same year that the strategic planning guidelines for the Greater Dublin Area Authority were published. Then into 1999, we have the National Development Plan being published. It has 5 operational programmes, 2 regional programmes, plus the Peace Process programme. And it called for balanced regional development and it identified 5 gateway cities. So the 5 gateway cities were Dublin, Cork, Galway, Limerick and Waterford, who on their own and with their hinterlands all had over 100,000 population. And then into 2000, we have the Planning Development Act of 2000, which sets up the basis for hierarchical planning. So it sets up the basis of how going from local area to county development to regional planning guidelines up to the NSS, and that they should work in sync with each other. So within that Act, it said that the local and county development plans will have due regard to the forthcoming regional planning guidelines. And then in September of 2001, the Regional Development Strategy, which is effectively the NSS for Northern Ireland, was published. Okay, so that's the kind of the first phase leading into this, which is a kind of a gradual evolution towards recognising the benefits of planning and spatial planning, and it's starting to move into particular things, but also the development of things like tax incentive-led property development also being initiated. And then we go into the rollout phase. So, as we've said, we have this kind of grand announcement around the NSS, and it's published in December of 2002. And in the same month, we have the Planning and Development Amendment Act published, which was one of these kind of guillotined acts through the Doyle, moved through very fast without being fully debated. And within that, it had a clause that exempted the zoning of land within local area plans from the oversight. So most of the overzoning that went on didn't go on through county development plans, it went on through these local area plans, and that kind of which was running counter actually to the NSS policy. That was a loophole that wasn't closed up until 2010. In 2003, which is the kind of the famous kind of death knell really of the NSS, was when Charlie McCreevy, much to the surprise actually of most of his cabinet, announced decentralisation. And he announced that 48 government departments or state agencies, over 10,000 public servants, would move to 58 locations and 25 local authorities, most of which weren't hubs or gateway towns. So you've got 2 policies about kind of moving, developing out plans and trying to grow particular areas and actually working counter to each other. 2004, you have the Regional Planning Guidelines. 2006, National Development Plan. And at this point, you have the NSS and the NDP being run jointly together. So the NSS is the logic that underpins the NDP and is guiding where spend is happening. So the NDP is sectoral and says like transport, health, education and so on, and the NSS is where do you spend that money on the sectoral basis. So they become aligned at that point, which was a really significant development. But then we enter into crisis in the back end of 2007 into 2008, and the Gateways Initiative Fund, which was one of the first vehicles for actually funding the NSS, was the very first thing that was cut in the Department of Environment. The 300 million Gateway Fund went. So this money that was going to finance the development disappeared. And then July 2010, we have the Planning and Development Amendment Act, which started to close off some of these loopholes. It started to close off having due regard. So one of the problems of the 2000 Act was local authorities and so on only had to have due regard to it. There was no statutory mandate that made. So this is what happened in 2010. We introduced core strategies, and it obliged planning authorities to comply with the NSS and with the regional planning guidelines, rather than just having regard to them. And then in 2010, we have a kind of an update and outlook, and basically just reaffirmed the NSS. It just said, we're going to keep going with this policy. And then really we move into this phase of disintegration, which is the NDP was terminated. It was succeeded by a National Recovery Plan, 2011 to 2014, introduced by DEPA. November 2011, we have an Infrastructure Capital Investment Plan. February 2013, the Minister Hogan officially scrapped the new policy, scrapped the policy of the NSS and said it would be replaced in due course. And then we have a series of other kinds of economic and planning strategies then being introduced. So we have the Medium Economic Term Strategy 2014 to 2020 published. We have Construction 2020 in May of 2014, which proposed a new national planning framework, had lots of task forces, lots of reviews, the kind of stuff that Connor was talking about in the previous session about creating new kind of policies and so on. And then May 2014, we have the Local Government Act, the Regional Authorities Amendment, and it takes the 8 regional authorities, reorganises them into the 3 regional assemblies. But one of their chief responsibilities is to prepare new regional and spatial economic strategies. So it seems to be pushing down the kind of spatial economic planning strategies down into the regional assembly level rather than at the national level. With the Local Government Reform Act, also in June of 2014, which kind of abolishes a lot of the town and borough councils. It merged 3 of the county and city councils, and therefore it reduced the number of planning authorities. So we went from 88 planning authorities down to 30-something. And then in January of this year, just to bring us right up to date, we have the Planning and Development Bill 2014 and the Planning Policy Statement. And they announced the establishment of the Office of the Planning Regulation and a national planning framework to replace the NSS. But of course, they've just been announced that they're going to happen, but we don't know what will be in them. And then lastly, just in February of this year, we have the Department of Jobs, Enterprise and Employment announcing a new framework for the development of regional enterprise strategies. So the Department of Jobs and Employment have regional enterprise strategies, and the Department of Environment has regional, spatial and economic strategies. I don't know what the difference between those are. I don't know whether they talk to each other. It seems quite odd that we have basically 2 regional economic strategies from 2 different departments, published within a couple of months of each other. It'll be interesting to see what happens in that space. So what you can kind of see there is there's a kind of disintegration and then a whole series of fractured replacements. So stuff that used to be coherent together has been replaced by a whole series of separate kind of policies. So why did the NSS fail? So try and run through this. I think first of all the strategy itself was flawed. Interesting, when it was announced, it was perceived to be a success, and actually other countries used to come and visit Ireland to come and look at our national spatial strategy and to see what they could learn. It was considered a best practice example. Okay, and then very quickly ran into trouble. And basically it sought to be all things to all people, to kind of create this win-win situation whereby every area was going to grow in population and resources. There were basically too many of these gateways and hubs. They were spread too thinly to provide an effective counterweight to Dublin. There were issues of critical mass. So a whole bunch of those of the gateway towns were nowhere near 100,000 population. It was a big ask to get them to grow there. Very few of the hubs were, the largest of the hubs was 21,500 people. These were places meant to grow. There were 3 places with less than 10,000. I think Cavan Town at the time had a population of 6,000. And, you know, that's just simply not enough. 6,000 is, a big village. It's not a node in a national and global economic network. It's a different scale down to a gateway or a hub should be. There was clearly some kind of political interference in the selection of the gateways and hubs. The recommendations that went in and what came out were not necessarily the same. The link concept was based on polycentric development that happens around large cities. You have cities, you have kind of towns around them. They're linked in, they form part of the same economy. One's a hinterland of the other. There's lots of interactions. But it was applied to small towns that had very little interaction with each other in an economic sense and were actually quite far apart from each other. I probably should have just had a small number of linked gateways and hubs around a handful of city regions and then another layer of different types of towns below that. And it had some regard for the regional development strategy in Northern Ireland, but it wasn't fully aligned. And if you could take the two maps and put them together, the arrows coming out of Northern Ireland into the south and the arrows going up into Northern Ireland the other way don't match. Okay, it's very interesting if you put those two plans in line with each other. Secondly, there was a temporal misalignment, so it basically missed its initial resourcing stream. If it had been funded, if it had come in line with the National Development Plan in 2000-2006, it would have got its initial funding stream at that point, and it would have had a series of actual initiatives that were on the ground and funded and resourced and so on. And then when it did get linked into the NDP in a very holistic, integrated way, the crisis hit, the NDP faltered, the resources allocated for the NSS evaporated. And then lastly, to go back to that last point from the opening statement, it was willfully undermined and not supported by government and by a kind of a lack of cross-department alignment. So there was a lack of statutory footing for hierarchical planning. You had to have due regard. You weren't obliged to do this. The decentralisation and policies such as the Upper Shannon Rural Renewal Scheme kind of cut across and ignored the NSS. And lots of other kind of sectoral policies also had problems around that, whether that was health or education or transport or whatever it might be. There was a general kind of lack of political and public support for plan-led development. And so there was a kind of a general culture of kind of clientelist, cronyist, localist planning systems and an attitude of kind of any development in any location at any time. And there was a presumption for development going on just about everywhere, right, which was kind of running against, so if you've got this kind of very laissez-faire, planner-led development, and this is a very kind of plan-led development, they're kind of running counter to each other. And then the Department of Finance and the Department of Environment kind of pursue their own agendas, and that kind of history shows you how there's this kind of backing them forward on a whole series of policies that often run counter to each other. And when we got into the crisis, I think both the economists and the planners reverted to type, and they became disconnected from each other. The economists basically reverted back to a kind of macro and sectoral, and spatial planning went out the window. Yeah. So what's it going to be replaced by? So what we have now is a situation where we have local, regional, national development is being driven predominantly by 5 initiatives. We have the kind of 350 county, city, local development plans, the regional planning guidelines and the legacy of the National Spatial Strategy. But then we also have Construction 2020, we have the medium-term economic strategy, we have the infrastructure and capital investment programme, we have the framework for the development of regional enterprise strategies. We also have those regional economic spatial strategies within the Department of Environment as well. And the first of those really is going to be reconfigured with the national planning framework taking on the role of the NSS to kind of coordinate, to be the top level of the hierarchical plan structure. And the objective of the national planning framework, so this is taken from the statement released at the beginning of this year, says the objective of the national planning framework shall be to establish a broad national plan for government in relation to strategic planning of urban and rural areas to secure balanced regional development and overall proper planning and sustainable development and the coordination of regional, spatial and economic strategies and city and county development plans, which is pretty much what the NSS statement says. Now, whether the national planning framework will deliver on its mandate, I think will depend on a few things. The first is I think this idea of all things to all people in all places is going to be difficult, and we just have to get round the notion of spatial selectivity and change some of our ideas about what success means. Is success everywhere grows and everywhere is development, or is success sustainable development, quality of life, good provision of services, and so on? And to change this notion of success, you can only be a successful place if your population is growing. That maybe that's not the definition of a good place. Maybe a good place is one that has a sustainable economy that supports the people who are there, provides a good level of services and gives a good quality of life. Maybe that's a different kind of aspiration. Poor planning, I think, was seen as one of the causes of the crisis, and it's certainly not been promoted as one of the solutions. And instead what we've had is sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. We need to kind of recognise that the MBP shouldn't be a top-level economic planning and should be a top-level policy, and that other policies need to be aligned back around it again. And I think we do need to move to the situation where we can join back up economic and spatial planning into a single framework where we had the NSS and the NDP aligned with each other. We need to move back to that situation rather than having a set of fractured policies. I think we also do need to have a set of implementation plans. We're really good in Ireland at having a whole set of policies that never ever get implemented, and we never have the tool set or the resource set to do that, and that needs to be built into the national planning framework. We're going to do this. This is how we're going to do it. These are the tools and the resources to do it. This is how you, as your town or your area, apply for that money to be able to draw down to do those things. It needs to be that level of detail from the general right down to the specific, and we need kind of set measures of success and so on. And we also need the government not to undermine its own policy and not to have different things working in different directions, either through contra policies or politicians exercising localism or stroke politics. And the last is we need local authorities, regional assemblies and local politicians rolling with rather than rolling against the national planning framework. And I think that's something that's going to be difficult because it means altering part of the political culture. So just to conclude, the Celtic Tiger happened without the benefits really of strategic spatial planning, and it collapsed in part for the same reason, leaving a legacy of overdevelopment in many places. And poor planning was seen as one of the causes of crisis. It's not been promoted as one of the solutions, and instead what we've led into is this kind of fracturing of planning and economic policy. I think if the national planning framework is done properly, it will help to grow the economy, it will create sustainable development, and it will improve people's quality of life. That's what it should do if it's done properly. I think the challenge, however, is twofold. The first is conjoining together existing national policies. What we've done at the minute is what you'd normally do is you'd set up the overarching policy and then the policies underneath. What we've started to do is set up all the other policies, and the framework for framing that is actually going to come last. We've got it the wrong way round. So we kind of need to reverse this trend about rolling out lower level ahead of top level, and we need to get this top level sorted out. And the second is we actually need the government to believe in their own rhetoric and to formulate a coherent national spatial plan with teeth and to implement it. And that definitely didn't happen with the National Spatial Strategy. Clearly didn't believe in their own rhetoric and introduced a whole series of policies that ran counter to it. And I'll just end by giving a plug, to the All Ireland Research Observatory. Which if you're interested in evidence-based planning, then if you go on to AIRO, which is just www.airo, you will find all the government data, public administration data for every local authority, every regional authority, all in nice interactive maps and graphs. You can play around, you can find out information for your area and so on. So it's a great kind of resource if you are actually interested in doing things with evidence. Sorry.